Hi everyone, I hope you're well. So it's been a while since I don't make a music related video, music themed video, and I was debating on making this one because I felt like maybe this was a bit too repetitive. There are some albums that I'm gonna talk about today that I have mentioned before in previous videos. Some of them more than once, well, one of them. I wanted to talk about the most depressing and gloomy and sort of, bleak and hopeless types of albums that I've heard, and mostly in terms of both the sound and the lyrics. So I want the sound to also be, pretty sad and depressing. Now, most of these albums are some type of rock or something similar, some derivative, and most specifically, most are 4AD kinds of artists. You'll probably notice that there's a lot of connections between an influence between the artists that I'm going to talk about. But I try to pick albums from different eras and that I think do sound pretty different from each other. By the way, the sun is setting right now, so the lighting is going to change throughout the video a lot. I'm also not going to be giving full reviews of the albums that I'm going to talk about, but rather I'm going to talk about the feeling that I get from them and why I think you should listen to them if you haven't already. Some of these are pretty well known. So the first one that I want to mention, to get it out of the way, basically because I mentioned this album before in like at least 2 videos, and this is Lisa Germano, Geek The Girl. I would say that at least all or at least most of Lisa Germano's albums are on the depressing side, or the darker side, I guess, the melancholic side. But Geek The Girl is probably the best one out of them, just in terms of the album as a whole. It's a sort of concept album with a coming of age story about a girl who faces cruelty, sexual violence, and maybe to some degree sexism. And she has some sort of mental breakdown throughout the album. Before the album basically takes place before, during, and after the breakdown, if you will, and then she sort of recovers from it, although she's not really the same person after that. And even by the end, it's definitely not as dark, I guess, as the middle of the album, but it's still pretty pessimistic. Next one is The Gathering, Souvenirs. It is an experimental rock album. This band was influenced by other sort of gloomy or dark sounding bands like Dead Can Dance. They used to be a doom metal band or gothic metal band. They sort of started having an experimental phase that they never really got out of, which is good because their experimental albums are great, and they're more, I guess, general rock albums. And this album actually seems to have a lot of Radiohead and maybe Massive Attack influences, at least based on the fact that the first song is called These Good People, which seems to be a reference to a line in Massive Attack's Rising Sun. Maybe an overall sadder or gloomier album by them is Home, which is the last one that had the vocalist Anneke van Giersbergen. But I feel like Souvenirs is by far a better album, and it's still pretty dark and melancholic. I feel like the cover art kind of deceives you a little bit. Well, I'm not sure but how you interpret it, but I feel like it does look pretty sweet. And well, it does have a lot of sweetness at this album, in the sense that it seems to be very warm, even though it's pretty sad. It's very comforting, even though it is melancholic. I also want to mention Blacklight District, which is an EP by them, by The Gathering, and the title track there is probably the darkest song that they've ever made. It's also pretty long. I also feel overall that Souvenirs is a pretty unique album in its sound. I feel like I've never been able to find a band that captures that same kind of sound that they had in that era, especially in that album. Next one is I never know how to pronounce it. Leonard Cohen, Songs of Love and Hate.
And the veins stand out like highways all along your wrist, and yes, it's come to this.
one that I think a lot of you already know about and already know as a depressing, gloomy album. I'm not sure. I feel like it's a pretty strongly introspective album. And of course, it is also very sad and gloomy. But I feel like introspective is the specific mood, I guess, behind it, aside from generally melancholic. Sometimes you're not really sure if the lyrics in third person are meant towards himself, or they're meant to be taken more literally towards someone else, or maybe he's talking about his own actions being seen through the eyes of someone else, or maybe he's talking to himself in a second person. I feel like there's just so many layers to the lyrics, and it's really interesting to see how people interpret them. However, I do feel like there is one song in this album that is blatantly about suicide, or at least about self-harm. And I feel like that song and Avalanche are the main ones that make it such a strongly or an extremely, depressing type of album. I remember that as a child, I once asked my mom why people listen to sad songs. We were listening to a sad song that sort of has the same style of Leonard Cohen. I think she said that it's not really that people want to feel sad sometimes, but rather that they want to be validated in their sadness. And I think that's partly the reason why a lot of people, gravitate towards this type of music, especially because sometimes you want to be told that the world really is as scary or as horrible as it seems sometimes to you. But it is music, and music isn't necessarily meant to make you happy. And fiction in general, it's not necessarily meant to make you happy. I feel like sometimes people do feel that way because they see fiction and art as something that is meant to escape life rather than to think about it or reflect on it. And I don't know, maybe that depends a lot on the conditions of your life, because maybe if your conditions are really, really horrible, you do feel like you have to escape, or that you should be able to escape through art. But I guess that also depends on how you view art in general. So I want to know around there, but the next one is Blonde Redhead, Misery is a Butterfly. And I'm just gonna say that I think this is a kind of similar one to Souvenirs. It's both sort of melancholic and sweet, and kind of like dream pop, I would say that there's some sort of naive type of sadness going on that is also present in their album 23, which came right after Misery is a Butterfly. I think it's very striking, especially in this album, how the vocals there's female and male vocals, and both of them are making this really vulnerable and weak voice. They almost sound at times like they're about to start crying at any moment, and I think that's actually something that makes this album really, really special, and I like about it. And that's on top of the very soft music and the very vulnerable lyrics that are already going on in the album. It only serves to make it more of an extremely vulnerable album. Next one is The Cure, Pornography. You all know this album most likely, and I've also mentioned it before in previous videos. So I don't want to repeat myself too much here, but in summary, I think it's so extreme in its, not necessarily its sadness, because I feel maybe Faith is a sadder album overall, except for that song. The song Doubt in Faith is more of an angry song than anything else. But I still feel like Pornography is much more extreme than Faith because of its almost like entire full rejection of everything, of the world, of life, and it seems to be almost completely pessimistic. And it's not a very catchy, inviting album, like I said like I've said in previous videos, but it's definitely not as pretty sounding as Misery is a Butterfly or Souvenirs. It's ugly, like I've said before. It's a very ugly sounding album, and it's sort of aggressive to listener. Like, you can't just listen. I feel like you wouldn't really just listen to this album the first time and feel like you love it, You kind of have to not necessarily be in the mood for it, because I would love it regardless, but you kind of have to know what you are getting into before you start listening to the album. Next one is This Mortal Coil, It'll End in Tears. That's kind of difficult to say. It will end in tears. So while I was thinking of this list, I was trying to figure out whether I should include an album by Dead Can Dance, and I wasn't really sure which one deserved to be called the saddest or, the gloomiest, most melancholic album by them. And then I figured out that I could just refer to this one instead, that has some songs that are written and sung by Lisa Germano, Jesus Christ, Lisa Gerard. Lisa Gerard from Dead Can Dance. And maybe their albums, the albums of Dead Can Dance are probably more bleak and cold rather than necessarily sad. But I would say this album is definitely on the sad side. This album also features Elizabeth Fraser from Cocteau Twins, yeah. And she was also in a couple of songs by Massive Attack. And I think because of all of these different 4AD artists, this album ends up sounding very dynamic, and also because the songs are pretty short. Most of the songs are some of them are like 2 minutes, almost 3 minutes. So they're pretty short. The album feels, and also because of that changing sound and style, the album feels pretty dynamic, and it doesn't feel like maybe some other albums in this list that some people would say feel claustrophobic or feel like the songs sound really similar to each other. Next is another one that you probably already all know about, which is Joy Division, Closer.
Procession moves on, the shouting is over.
And since all of you probably know about it already, I won't really say too much about it, but I will say it's probably the lyrics to me that make this more extreme or more depressing than Unknown Pleasures by them. There's something in the lyrics, sometimes they are obviously more metaphorical, but more than straightforward. But there's something in not just the sound is also horrifyingly, I can't really say sad, because I feel like sad doesn't really cut it with these albums, There's something just full of despair and hopelessness in the sound itself and also in the lyrics, I think, and especially something really horrible about listening to him saying this line in isolation that always hurts me so much when I hear it, when he says, "I am ashamed of the person I am." I mean, I feel like if you heard someone that you love say something like that, I feel like that would really worry you, So this was never even meant to be a ranking, but I do want to give an honorary mention before I get to the last one that I wanted to talk about. And my honorary mention is Giles Corey, the self-titled album, which is of course Giles Corey. I do remember that I once showed this album, or at least a couple of songs, to a friend of mine, and he said that he didn't say this exactly, but he said it was so emo and basically too on the nose and too obvious about being sad, I guess. And I mean, I do remember thinking that and going, I mean, maybe I guess you could say lacks the subtlety of some other, depressing albums. Even that I'm not sure, because I feel like there's a lot of people who would say that the previous albums that I have mentioned are really over the top and over dramatic, or melodramatic, really. I think a lot of people felt that way about Pornography, and I don't know. This is definitely, I think, regardless of that, this is definitely a very, very depressing album, and it's definitely one of the most despair-filled ones. I think I do understand, though, that there's some points in the lyrics, especially, that kind of make you want to. They seem like it's trying to tell you to be sad rather than forcing you to be really sad, or to experience the sadness that the author, the narrator, is experiencing. And I feel like the previous albums that I have mentioned are a bit more complex in their emotional depth, I guess. They're not really, and I don't think any of the previous albums are just outright sad or outright depressing. They have a lot of, layers, like a Shrek or something, going on in them. Like there's some guilt, there's shame, there's sadness, there's despair, hopelessness, regret, things like that. Emotions are adjacent to sadness, but aren't just plain sadness. There's more complexity to human emotions, obviously. And I feel like maybe in comparison, Giles Corey is a little bit more simple. So my number one, I guess, or the last one that I'm going to talk about, is Nico, the Marble Index.
Now you see that only dreams can send you where you want to be. Now you find us.
I think this one is a slight bit darker than Desert Shore, and I'm not just saying that because of the album cover, the fact that it's literally darker. But for example, Chelsea Girls, the first solo album by her, is a very emotional album, but it's also really warm. It's sort of, it doesn't want to be too, it's not really antagonizing the listener or anything. It's just having its sad moments, but being overall pretty listenable, being pretty pleasant to listen to. And by far her second album is much colder, The Marble Index. It feels like it wasn't written to be liked, it was written by her in a moment where she didn't even want to be liked as an artist or be liked as a person, so to speak. I mean, because I feel like when you write this, there's no way that you don't know that it is good. But, and I don't want to praise her too much because Nico was kind of a terrible person apparently, but I guess I compare it so much to pornography in my previous video because both are kind of hard to find pleasant at first. And also, there was something with pornography. I think Robert Smith himself said at some point that he wrote pornography wanting people to be kind of disgusted by the album and not really like it as at face value, but like it for what it is. Well, that's kind of my interpretation, I guess, but he definitely said that he wanted people to be disgusted by the album, and think of it as ugly and dirty, which is probably why it's titled that way. And the Marble Index is equally unpleasant at first. She's not trying to be sweet and soft in her voice. The lyrics are definitely very, very harsh. I think Ari's song is probably my favorite from this album because she's using these phrases about wanting joy and light and dreams for her son, but you can tell from the context, from the rest of the lyrics and from the music and from the way that she's singing, you can tell that she doesn't actually have that much hope. Like, she doesn't actually expect the world to be ever that full of joy and light. So that's pretty much my list of depressing albums that I like. I hope you liked it. I hope that you didn't already know all of these albums from before. And I mean, I guess I'm kind of a beginner, somewhat of a beginner listener when it comes to this type of music in particular, because I've definitely noticed that there's so much more to this genre that I used to think there was. And I'm really excited to keep listening to, these sort of slowcore artists and more goth bands or, goth adjacent bands that make this sort of music, so that I can make an updated version of this list or a part 2. So I hope you enjoyed this video, and I'll see you in the next one.